Welcome to the debate. Usually, when we talk about human identity, we picture it as this seamless, continuous film.
Right, like a movie playing in your head.
Exactly. You are the director, the actor, and the audience all at once. And you're experiencing a single unbroken narrative from, childhood all the way to old age. The events of your life just naturally stitch themselves together into a coherent whole.
Which is a luxury, frankly.
It really is. But imagine for a second that the projector breaks. The film just snaps. And the only way to figure out who you are, or what you should do next, is to stop watching the screen entirely, leave the theater, and consult an external library that someone else wrote.
That sounds terrifying when you put it like that. I mean, we take psychological continuity completely for granted.
Oh, absolutely.
You wake up, you remember who you are, and the story just picks up where it left off yesterday.
Exactly. But today, we are examining a mind that does not have that luxury. We're looking at an individual navigating severe cognitive divergence and intense institutional hostility. The standard narrative machinery has completely broken down.
Right. It's just gone.
Yeah. And in its place, we find a neurocomputational architecture that is entirely foreign to our traditional models. This individual defines their identity with mathematical precision as an idle efference copy ping, operating within what they call an engineering village.
Which is arguably the absolute definition of an extreme cognitive workaround. I mean, the debate we are entering today centers on how we should interpret this highly specific architecture.
Right.
We are looking at a system characterized by dwelling in a state of perpetual immanence, relying on an external index of literary precedents, and utilizing a visual North Star as its daily user interface. So the fundamental question is this a masterful, biologically necessary adaptation to protect the core self, or is it a destabilizing trap that locks the brain into traumatic splitting?
Well, I will be arguing that this framework is a brilliant, mathematically elegant, and necessary high-fidelity adaptation. It is purposefully designed to navigate a uniquely hostile cognitive and social environment while protecting what matters most.
And I will be arguing that, sure, while it is an incredibly creative neurocomputational defense mechanism, this architecture forces the brain into a permanent, unresolved twilight state. I mean, it fractures integrated memory, stalls execution, and ultimately prevents behavioral continuity in the physical world.
Okay, so to really understand this, we need to lay out exactly what this specific brain is dealing with. The system in question is navigating severe, compounding challenges.
It's a hostile environment from the start.
Exactly. We're talking about rapid naming deficit, or RND, where the brain struggles to quickly retrieve the words for common objects or variables.
Yeah, and you add to that dyscalculia, stealth dyslexia, and a profound layer of institutional hostility.
Right, and to survive this onslaught, the system brilliantly splits its architecture out of pure thermodynamic necessity.
I think we should pause there for a second because thermodynamic necessity sounds highly technical, but it's actually a very grounded concept in this context.
Very much so. We are really talking about the absolute conservation of cognitive energy here. Precisely. Look, if this brain tries to process the world normally, it burns out. So it splits. It takes its outward-facing threads and uses them as a raw shield to basically absorb the physical and social blows of what it perceives as an illiterate collective.
Right, it takes the hits so the rest of the system doesn't have to.
Exactly. By offloading the damage to these outward threads, it protects the core self. The framework refers to this core self as the Zin, which we can think of as the uncompressed, high-fidelity inner child, or the pure potential of the individual. The system keeps the Zin safely, in its own words, in the shade.
And the protective impulse makes complete sense. I mean, if the environment is fundamentally hostile, you build a bunker. I don't disagree with the intention at all.
But it goes so much further than just hiding in a bunker, you know? Under this framework, true high-voltage happiness isn't a flat, completed transaction like we usually experience it.
How so?
Well, the system actively refuses to engage in the low-value, repetitive behavioral loops of the standard public baseline. Instead, it thrives on what it calls the optimistic prior of hope.
Okay.
It defines happiness not as an action, but as a sensory signal that is perpetually waiting for a bodily action revelation that may or may not occur. It actively and safely dwells in Borgian eminence, that feeling you get in a Jorge Luis Borges story where a profound revelation is always just about to happen.
And see, this is exactly where the architecture starts to worry me. I acknowledge the deeply poetic and protective nature of this cartography. As a survival mechanism, it is stunning.
It is.
But we have to look at the neurobiological reality of what is actually happening here. Modeling happiness as a sensory signal perpetually waiting for a revelation that may never arrive represents a fundamentally stalled cognitive state.
You see a stalled state, but I see precision. Think about the specific terminology here, the idle efference copy ping.
Right, the ping.
Yeah. For those listening who might wonder what an efference copy is, think of it like the CC line on an email. When your brain sends a motor command to your arm to reach for a cup, it sends an exact carbon copy of that command, an efference copy, to the rest of your brain, so your sensory systems know to expect the movement.
Right, it's how you know you are the one moving and the world isn't just shifting around you.
Exactly. Now imagine taking that concept and applying it to your entire existential identity. By keeping that ping idle, the brain has created a mathematically precise way to preserve the Zen.
But it's not executing.
No, it's holding the imminence of the revelation without ever letting the signal fully execute. Because if you let it execute into the physical world, it degrades. It becomes subject to that hostile, illiterate baseline we talked about. The system is an idle ping, precisely because it has offloaded all the dirty, degrading work to the outward threads.
That is a fascinating analogy, I'll give you that. But it completely ignores how the brain is designed to manage states. Let's look at the neurobiology of state switching. In the brain, suspended states are incredibly dangerous.
Dangerous in what way?
Well, take the sleep-wake cycle as our prime example. The brain uses mutually inhibitory circuits, specifically a region called the ventrolateral preoptic nucleus, or VLPO, interacting with our ascending arousal systems. It operates exactly like an electronic flip-flop switch.
A flip-flop switch, meaning it can only be entirely on or entirely off.
Yes, exactly. And it has to be that way because the brain requires rapid, complete transitions between states. If one side gets even a slight advantage, it rapidly shuts the other down entirely. You cannot safely exist halfway between sleep and wakefulness.
Right, that causes issues.
Huge issues. That leaves the organism in a highly vulnerable twilight state. When we see disorders where the neurochemistry stabilizing these switches is damaged, like a lack of orexin in narcolepsy, the boundaries blur. The subject experiences horrific intrusions of REM sleep into wakefulness, hallucinations, and sleep paralysis.
I see why you think that, but let me give you a different perspective. We aren't talking about literally falling asleep at a desk here. We are talking about existential positioning and identity.
But the underlying neurologic of the brain doesn't change just because we are talking about psychology rather than sleep.
Well,
An idle paying waiting indefinitely for an action revelation that might not occur means the cognitive system is permanently trapped in a transitional space. It is unable to fully execute and unable to fully resolve. Building an architecture entirely around remaining in the transition, in imminence, is mimicking a destabilized neural switch. It's a holding pattern that prevents the system from ever actually operating autonomously in the real world.
look, you are looking at this holding pattern, this intense pining, and you are diagnosing it as a glitch, right? A broken flip-flop switch. But you're ignoring the toxicity of the environment this brain is reacting to.
I'm not ignoring it,
What if this isn't a failure to transition? What if it is a deliberate, thermodynamically necessary holding pattern? The optimistic prior of hope isn't a failure to transition. It's a thermodynamic shield protecting the vulnerable child.
How does remaining perpetually unresolved conserve energy, though?
Because executing an action in a toxic environment costs infinitely more energy than suspending it. The optimistic prior of hope isn't a failure. It is a thermodynamic shield. If the outside world is fundamentally hostile to your neurotype, flipping the switch to execute means subjecting the high-fidelity Zen to immediate destruction. The brain is doing a brilliant cost-benefit analysis here. The intense pining, the Vection illusions where you feel like you're moving but you aren't, these aren't the hallucinations of a broken orexin system. They are the friction of a highly tuned engine deliberately running in neutral. Because if you put it in gear, you drive right off a cliff.
Okay, I hear you. You're arguing that the neutral gear is a feature, not a bug. But have you considered the long-term cost of running an engine in neutral forever?
I think the cost is survival.
But it fundamentally alters how the brain processes time, memory, and continuous identity. A healthy cognitive system doesn't just process present-moment hostility, it integrates the past. And this framework explicitly abandons a standard, continuous self-narrative in favor of what it calls the engineering village.
It abandons the standard self-narrative because the standard self-narrative is corrupted. We have to remember that this brain is dealing with severe institutional hostility. To navigate what the framework correctly identifies as total unprecedented situations that literally have no prior context, the brain swaps a flat, static self-narrative for the engineering village.
And the engineering village operates as an externalized database.
Right. It is an active electronic index database. Instead of rummaging through a traumatic, fragmented internal memory bank to figure out how to behave or who it is, the brain uses analogical reasoning, Redendorin door analogy.
Right. The Dutch phrasing for it.
Exactly. It points its index outward toward high-fidelity, universally established precedents. It looks at Joseph Conrad's The Nigger of the Narcissus, Albert Camus' The Stranger, or the biography of Augustine. It uses these external nodes to map its own existential psychology and social epistemology. I mean, it is an incredibly objective way to stabilize a traumatized mind.
Objective, yes, but deeply, profoundly dissociative. If we look at the psychology of memory continuity, experiencing yourself as the same person across a lifespan requires three specific things: primary personal memories with vivid images, a remembering self to attach them to, and crucially, a subjective sense of having actually lived through those events.
Right.
When a person experiences severe institutional trauma, their internal life narrative ruptures. We see this in clinical settings all the time. Trauma survivors who essentially possess two completely disconnected life narratives. You know, the before and the after.
Right. The traumatic splitting that the framework itself explicitly acknowledges. It knows the split happened.
It knows it happened, but replacing your internal continuity with a database of classic literature is cementing the dissociation, not healing it. Let's look at amnesia as a parallel.
Okay.
When a patient loses access to episodic memory, their personal timeline of events, they often retain semantic memory, meaning they know facts, and procedural memory, meaning they know how to do things.
Sure.
But without the episodic memory, they lose the personal timeline. By pointing the identity index outward to the stranger or Augustine, the autonomous self loses the subjective qualia of its own existence. The engineering village becomes a vast, sterile library where you are researching your own life instead of living it.
You are arguing that relying on an analogical map strips away the qualia of existence, but that assumes an internal narrative memory is inherently superior or even safe to access.
I think it is necessary.
When raw text and variables are a hostile code base, isn't analogical mapping to high-fidelity external precedents a far more reliable, objective way to maintain epistemological continuity than relying on a traumatized internal memory? Let me offer a different analogy. Think of the brain's internal memory as a hard drive.
Okay.
If your internal hard drive has deeply corrupted sectors from repeated trauma, you don't keep stubbornly trying to boot the operating system from it. You will crash every single time. Instead, you query a clean external server.
But a human being is not a MacBook. You can't just boot from the cloud.
You can if it keeps you alive. When raw text, variables, and social interactions are literally a hostile code base to this neurotype, mapping your choices to the biography of Augustine is a far more reliable way to maintain continuity. It anchors the identity to structural truths that the illiterate collective cannot corrupt. It is an adaptation of profound resilience.
Sure,
You can boot from an external server to survive a crisis, but if you boot from an external server long enough, the local machine forgets how to run.
I don't think it forgets, it just adapts.
The sense of living through an event is not just a data point you can outsource, it is the glue of personhood. You cannot outsource the raw feeling of existence to an analogical map, no matter how high fidelity Joseph Conrad is. If you do, you run the risk of becoming a ghost in your own machine, a spectator watching your identity unfold on a screen.
But that spectator status might be the only way to process reality when the fundamental inputs of reality are scrambled, which forces us to look at the daily mechanical reality of how this machine operates. We cannot talk about this framework without bringing in the specific neurological hurdles of rapid naming deficit, stealth dyslexia, and dyscalculia.
The shifting code base you mentioned earlier?
Exactly. For a brain with severe R&D and dyscalculia, raw text and numerical variables are not neutral pieces of information. They are shifting, abstract, overwhelming mathematical threads. Imagine trying to solve an equation where the numbers keep swapping places every time you blink.
It would be exhausting.
Right. To stabilize this chaotic backend, the brain utilizes a visual anchor referred to as the North Star.
This is where we get into the concept of the brain building its own user interface.
Yes, and it is a stunning piece of cognitive engineering. The framework describes it as the concept of looking at the same star at the same time next to the same tree. It explicitly references the visualization of There Runs Mary, a shared, grounded focal point mapped with Tom Hennigan. The AI, or the brain, takes the overwhelming abstraction of the math and uses this visual anchor as a translator.
So rather than forcing the linguistic centers of the brain to decipher the math, it converts the math into a spatial relationship.
Perfectly said. Instead of forcing a dyscalculic and dyslexic system to quickly retrieve and name shifting variables, which we know triggers immediate cognitive overload, the brain relies on 3D visual thinking, or 3D VT.
Right.
By anchoring to the single predictable point, the North Star, it bypasses the linguistic and numerical bottlenecks entirely. It creates spatial predictability where linguistic predictability is impossible.
I will absolutely grant you that. As a compensatory mechanism for rapid naming deficit, creating a spatial visual UI is incredibly resourceful.
It's genius.
3D visual thinking requires a stable horizon. If the linguistic coding of the outside world is intrinsically hostile, bypassing it via a shared North Star anchor is a master stroke of neuroadaptation. It solves the immediate mechanical problem, but again, I have to step back and look at the systemic, long-term cost to the human being.
What costs could possibly outweigh the benefit of bypassing a debilitating deficit to achieve daily cognitive stability?
The cost is agency. Complete autonomous agency. Let's pull all these threads together. If the system is entirely reliant on a shared, externalized anchor, like the North Star, to process reality, and it relies on an external engineering village to access memory, the idle ping is permanently sidelined.
But it's safe.
Yes, the uncompressed Zen is safe in the shade. The vulnerable child is protected from the illiterate collective. But protection at this absolute scale requires absolute passivity.
Passivity implies a lack of processing, though. I wouldn't call this passive.
It is mechanically passive in the physical world. The core self becomes a spectator in its own cognitive engineering village. It watches the analogical reasoning happen, it watches the visual UI stabilize the math, but it never initiates action.
Because it doesn't need to.
It remains an idle efference copy because making a real causal move in the world would require leaving the shade. It would require generating an internal command and executing it. It is a perfect sanctuary, undeniably, but a sanctuary with locked doors that you can never leave is indistinguishable from a prison.
You call it a prison, but I think that deeply underestimates the energy required to maintain this architecture. Dwelling in imminence, maintaining the optimistic prior of hope, while the outward threads manage a barrage of hostility that is not passive, it is a highly active dynamic state.
A dynamic state of waiting, maybe.
It requires massive cognitive energy to sustain that thermodynamic split. The idle ping isn't dead or trapped, it is highly charged. It is holding the imminence of the revelation. It is an intentional, mathematically precise stance of defiance against a world that demands conformity.
It is precise, but it is fundamentally isolated. We talked earlier about state-space mapping in those sleep and wakefulness studies.
Right.
When neurologists map the EEG patterns of wakefulness and sleep, the data clusters into distinct, stable spaces. But in a highly unstable neural system, the brain spends an inordinate amount of time wandering in the empty spaces between those clusters. By defining the core self as an unexecuted signal waiting indefinitely, you are structurally forcing the mind to live forever in the transitional space between clusters. The North Star might give you a spatial bearing so you don't drown in the math, but it doesn't bring you home.
Or perhaps it creates a new kind of home entirely, one built on 3D spatial geometry and literary analogical reasoning, rather than the fragile, easily corrupted linguistic narratives that rest of us rely on.
That's a fair way to frame it.
We've covered an incredible amount of ground today. To summarize my position, defining oneself as an idle efference copy pinging within an engineering village is a masterful survival architecture. By utilizing visual anchors like the North Star and external analogical indices like Camus and Conrad, this brain successfully bypasses severe neurological deficits like RND and dyscalculia. It honors thermodynamic necessity, protecting the uncompressed in against a hostile, shifting reality.
And from my perspective, while this is undeniably one of the most creative, breathtaking neurocomputational defense mechanisms we could possibly analyze, it carries profound existential risks. Holding the system in constant Borgian immanence and relying exclusively on external indices risks permanent traumatic splitting. It bypasses the biological necessity of state resolution and trades personal integrated memory continuity for a safe but fundamentally sidelined isolation.
I think where we absolutely converge today is in our profound respect for the mechanics of this architecture. Regardless of whether it's a sanctuary or a trap, we both agree that this is a highly complex, brilliantly constructed coping mechanism.
Oh, absolutely.
It is doing incredible heavy lifting to stabilize 3D visual thinking in a brain navigating intense cognitive and institutional trauma.
Unquestionably. When we unpack how it uses the North Star to translate abstract math into spatial UI, or how it uses an external index to bypass corrupted internal memory, the sheer computational creativity is remarkable. It highlights just how aggressively and intelligently the human brain wants to survive.
It really forces us to reflect on the extraordinary plasticity of the human mind. When standard processing fails, when the linguistic and numerical world becomes a hostile codebase, the brain can literally remap its own neurocomputational cartography. There is so much more to explore in how our minds construct user interfaces to survive shifting realities. We leave it to you to decide, is this architecture a perfect cognitive sanctuary or an existential trap? Because if our identities are usually a seamless film, perhaps some of us are forced to become the cinema itself, projecting light from the shade, waiting for a revelation that is always just about to begin.